The gavel came down with the finality of thunder, and just like that, Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson's life was over. Guilty on all counts, the judge declared, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. 15 years to life. Michael stood perfectly still, his military training keeping his back straight even as his world collapsed around him. In the gallery behind him, his wife Sarah sobbed into her hands while their 8-year-old daughter Emily clung to her grandmother, too young to understand why Daddy was being taken away but old enough to know something terrible was happening. The crime had shocked the small town of Millfield, a brutal home invasion that left an elderly couple dead and their house ransacked. The community demanded justice, and when evidence pointed to the decorated Afghanistan veteran who'd been struggling to adjust to civilian life, they got their answer. Or so they thought. What nobody knew, not the jury, not the prosecutor, not even Michael's own lawyer, was that 15 years later, a single DNA test would prove what Michael had been saying all along: he was innocent. And the real killer? He'd been walking free, living 3 blocks from the courthouse, watching an innocent man's life destroyed while he went about his business selling insurance and coaching Little League. Welcome to Untold Hidden Stories. Before we dive into this powerful story of injustice, perseverance, and ultimate vindication, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the system fails, but the truth never dies. Michael Thompson had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne, earning a Bronze Star for pulling wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee outside Kandahar. When he came home to Millfield in 2008, he was supposed to be starting the next chapter of his life, maybe using his GI benefits to study engineering, building a family with Sarah, coaching Emily's soccer team on weekends. Instead, he found himself dealing with nightmares that made him wake up in cold sweats, flashbacks triggered by car backfiring, and a persistent anxiety that made crowds feel like threat assessments. The VA called it adjustment disorder. His neighbors called it trouble waiting to happen. The trouble came on October 15, 2009, but not in the way anyone expected. Harold and Beatrice Winters were found dead in their home on Elm Street, victims of what appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. Harold, 73, had been a retired mailman who'd delivered letters to half the town for 40 years. Beatrice, 71, had taught Sunday school at the Baptist church and made pies for every church fundraiser. They were the kind of people who left their doors unlocked and waved to strangers from their front porch. The crime scene told a story of violence and desperation: ransacked rooms, overturned furniture, a safe that had been pried open with a crowbar. Harold had been killed with a single gunshot to the chest. Beatrice had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object, later determined to be a baseball bat that was never found. The investigation moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Millfield police force, was under pressure to solve the case. The mayor was breathing down the chief's neck, the media was asking uncomfortable questions about crime rates, and the town was scared. When Morrison learned that Michael Thompson had been seen arguing with Harold Winters at the hardware store 2 weeks before the murders, he had his first lead. When he discovered that Michael had been having financial troubles, behind on his mortgage, struggling with medical bills from Sarah's difficult pregnancy earlier that year, he had his motive. And when a witness came forward claiming to have seen a man matching Michael's description leaving the Winters neighborhood around the time of the murders, Morrison thought he had his case. The witness was Derek Hartley, a 34-year-old insurance salesman who lived on Oak Street, just 3 blocks from the crime scene. He told police he'd been walking his dog around 9 p.m. on the night of the murders when he saw a tall man in military fatigues leaving the area in a hurry. "Looked like that soldier guy who's been having problems," Hartley told Detective Morrison. "You know, the one everyone's been talking about." Seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder. It wasn't the strongest identification. Hartley admitted he'd only seen the man for a few seconds, and it had been dark. But combined with the argument at the hardware store and Michael's financial situation, it was enough for Morrison to bring him in for questioning. Michael's story was simple and consistent. He'd been home with Sarah and Emily all evening, helping with homework and watching television. Sarah corroborated every detail. But Morrison had seen domestic violence cases where wives lied to protect abusive husbands, and he assumed this was more of the same. The case might have remained circumstantial if not for the discovery, 3 days later, of Harold Winter's stolen watch in a pawn shop on the other side of town. The pawn shop owner remembered the seller, a tall man in his 30s who'd seemed nervous, paid in cash for the transaction, and provided identification that matched Michael Thompson's description. Except it hadn't been Michael Thompson. The security camera footage was grainy. The timestamp showed it had been recorded at 2 p.m. on the day after the murders, when Michael could prove he'd been at a VA appointment across town. But the footage quality was poor enough that the identification wasn't definitively conclusive, and Michael's lawyer, an overworked public defender named James Walsh, failed to push hard enough on the timeline discrepancy. The physical evidence was thin. No fingerprints at the crime scene that matched Michael's. No DNA evidence linking him to the murders. No witnesses who could place him at the scene at the time of the crime. But the circumstantial case was compelling enough for a jury already primed to believe that troubled veterans could snap without warning. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution painted Michael as a time bomb waiting to explode, a combat veteran struggling with mental health issues, financial pressure, and a history of confrontation with one of the victims. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about PTSD and its potential for triggering violence, even though Michael's symptoms were relatively mild and he'd never shown any signs of aggression. The defense was hampered by limited resources and Walsh's inexperience with major felony cases. He focused on the lack of physical evidence but failed to adequately challenge the timeline inconsistencies or pursue alternative theories of the crime. He didn't hire his own expert witnesses, didn't conduct independent investigations, and didn't dig deeply enough into Derek Hartley's background or motivations. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, guilty of armed burglary, guilty of theft. Michael Thompson was sentenced to 15 years to life, with the possibility of parole after serving the minimum term. Sarah filed for divorce 6 months after the conviction. She'd stood by him through the trial, but the strain of being married to a convicted murderer, the financial pressure of supporting Emily alone, and the social isolation that came with being associated with the case finally broke her resolve. She moved across the country with Emily, changed their last name, and tried to build a new life free from the shadow of Michael's conviction. Michael understood. In her position, he might have made the same choice. Prison was a different kind of war zone, and Michael's military training served him well. He kept his head down, stayed out of conflicts, and used his time productively. He earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree through a correspondence program. He worked in the prison library, helping other inmates with legal research and literacy programs. He wrote letters to Innocence Projects, to journalists, to anyone who might listen to his story, but the responses were polite form letters that essentially said they couldn't help without new evidence. The years passed slowly. Michael watched other inmates come and go, some genuinely reformed, others just better at gaming the system. He saw men who'd committed terrible crimes find religion or education or simply peace with what they'd done. And he wrestled daily with the reality that he was surrounded by people who, unlike him, actually belonged there. The nightmares from Afghanistan faded, replaced by different dreams, of Emily's 8th birthday party that he'd missed, of Sarah's graduation from nursing school that he'd heard about through a brief letter, of all the moments of normal life that had been stolen from him by someone else's crime. He came up for parole twice and was denied both times. The parole board cited the brutality of the crimes, his continued maintenance of innocence, which they interpreted as a lack of acceptance of responsibility, and letters from the victims' family members who couldn't bear the thought of their loved one's killer walking free. By 2024, Michael Thompson had been in prison for 15 years. He was 52 years old, his hair more gray than brown, his face marked by the years of institutional life. Emily was now 23, a college graduate who'd grown up believing her father was a murderer. Sarah had remarried and rarely spoke of her first marriage to anyone. And Michael might have died in prison, his innocence known only to himself and whatever higher power he'd found during the long nights in his cell, if not for a break in a seemingly unrelated case 3 counties away. Detective Lisa Chin of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department was working a cold case from 2018, a home invasion that had killed an elderly man and critically injured his wife. The crime had similarities to dozens of other burglaries in the region, but this one had finally yielded DNA evidence from blood left on a broken window. When the DNA was run through CODIS, the FBI's national database, it came back with a hit: Derek Hartley, now 51 years old, still living in Millfield, still selling insurance, still coaching Little League, still walking his dog past the scene of the Winters murders every evening. Hartley had been arrested in 2019 for a domestic violence incident that required a DNA sample, but the charges had been dropped when his girlfriend declined to press charges. The DNA had remained in the system, waiting for the right match. Detective Chin noticed the similarities between her 2018 case and several other unsolved home invasions targeting elderly victims across 3 counties. All featured similar methods of entry, similar items stolen, and a particular brutality toward victims who resisted. When she ran Hartley's name through various databases, she discovered his connection to the Winters case, not as a suspect, but as the key witness whose testimony had helped convict Michael Thompson. Something about that didn't sit right with Chen, so she dug deeper. What she found was a pattern that should have been obvious 15 years earlier. In every jurisdiction where Derek Hartley had lived, he'd moved frequently, always staying within a 100-mile radius of Millfield. There had been unsolved home invasions targeting elderly victims. The crime stretched back to 2005, 2 years before the Winters murders, and continued sporadically up through 2018. Chin brought her findings to the Millfield Police Department, where Detective Morrison had retired and been replaced by a younger generation of investigators who were more familiar with modern forensic techniques and more skeptical of convictions based primarily on circumstantial evidence. Detective Sarah Walsh, ironically, the daughter of Michael's original defense attorney, reopened the Winters case and submitted evidence from the crime scene for DNA testing that hadn't been available in 2009. Modern techniques could extract DNA from smaller, more degraded samples than had been possible 15 years earlier. The results came back in March 2024. Derek Hartley's DNA was found on the crowbar marks on the Winters safe, on fabric fibers caught on the broken back door frame, and on a cigarette butt found in the backyard, a cigarette butt that had been collected as evidence but never tested because the original investigators hadn't thought it was relevant. On April 15, 2024, almost exactly 15 years after Michael Thompson had been convicted, Derek Hartley was arrested at his office while explaining life insurance policies to a retired couple who reminded him, uncomfortably, of Harold and Beatrice Winters. The story made national news within hours. A decorated veteran wrongly convicted of murder. A killer who had walked free for 15 years, continuing to prey on elderly victims while an innocent man rotted in prison. A criminal justice system that had failed catastrophically, not through malice but through tunnel vision, inadequate resources, and the pressure to solve a case quickly. Michael Thompson learned about his vindication not from a lawyer or a judge, but from a corrections officer who'd seen the news on television. "Thompson," the guard said, unlocking his cell door. "Pack your things. You're going home." Home, it turned out, was a complicated concept for a man who'd lost 15 years of his life. Michael walked out of Millfield Correctional Institution on April 18, 2024, carrying the same small bag of belongings he'd brought with him in 2009. The world had changed dramatically during his incarceration. Smartphones were everywhere, social media dominated communication, electric cars were becoming common, and a global pandemic had reshaped society in ways he was still trying to understand. More challenging than technological changes were the personal ones. Emily agreed to meet with him, but their relationship was tentative and formal. She was willing to acknowledge his innocence but couldn't easily bridge the gap of 15 lost years. Sarah sent a card congratulating him on his exoneration, but made it clear that she'd built a new life and wasn't looking to revisit the past. The state of Pennsylvania eventually paid Michael a settlement of $15 million for his wrongful conviction, $1 million for each year he'd been incarcerated. It was the largest wrongful conviction settlement in the state's history, and it made headlines for weeks. But no amount of money could restore the time he'd lost, the relationships that had been destroyed, or the simple experience of living freely during what should have been the prime years of his life. Derek Hartley, meanwhile, was charged with 14 counts of murder and dozens of additional charges related to home invasions across 3 counties. His crime spree had begun in 2005 and continued until his arrest, with the Winters murders representing just one incident in a 15-year pattern of violence against elderly victims. He would eventually plead guilty to avoid the death penalty and receive multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. At Hartley's sentencing hearing, Michael Thompson was given the opportunity to address the man whose lies had cost him 15 years of freedom. He stood at the podium, looking directly at Hartley for the first time since the trial that had destroyed his life, and spoke for less than 2 minutes. "I don't hate you," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Hate is a poison that would hurt me more than it would hurt you. But I want you to know that your choices didn't just affect me. They affected my daughter, who grew up believing her father was a murderer. They affected my ex-wife, who carried the shame of being married to a convicted killer. They affected every person in this community who lived in fear while you were free to keep hurting people." He paused, looking around the courtroom filled with victims' families, reporters, and law enforcement officials. "I served my country with honor, and I've tried to serve my sentence with dignity. But you robbed me of 15 years I'll never get back. You robbed families of loved ones who didn't have to die. And you robbed this community of justice and peace of mind. I forgive you because forgiveness is the only way I can move forward. But I will never forget what you took from all of us." Michael Thompson walked out of that courtroom a free man, not just in the legal sense but in the spiritual sense. He'd survived 2 wars, one in Afghanistan and one in prison, and emerged with his integrity intact. Today, Michael works with the Innocence Project, helping to investigate other cases of wrongful conviction. He's particularly focused on cases involving veterans, understanding how PTSD and adjustment disorders can make former soldiers vulnerable to rushed judgments and inadequate legal representation. He's rebuilt a relationship with Emily, who now understands the difference between the father she thought she had and the father she actually has. They meet for dinner once a month, and she's introduced him to his 3-year-old grandson, a boy who knows his grandfather as the man who helps innocent people, not as a man who was wrongly imprisoned. Michael never remarried, but he's found peace in his work and in the small freedoms that most people take for granted, the ability to walk outside whenever he wants, to choose what to eat for dinner, to sleep in a bed with clean sheets in a room with a door that doesn't lock from the outside. The case changed how Millfield handles major crime investigations, leading to better training, more thorough evidence collection, and protocols designed to prevent tunnel vision. Detective Morrison, the original investigator, publicly apologized for his mistakes and became an advocate for criminal justice reform before his death in 2023. But perhaps the most important change was in the community itself. The people of Millfield learned that justice isn't just about solving cases quickly or satisfying public demand for answers. True justice requires patience, thoroughness, and the humility to acknowledge when the system has failed. Michael Thompson's story isn't just about one man's wrongful conviction. It's about the fragility of justice, the importance of thorough investigation, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It's about how a decorated veteran who'd already given so much to his country was asked to sacrifice 15 more years of his life for a crime he didn't commit. But mostly, it's about how the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of surfacing. And how one man's refusal to let injustice break his spirit ultimately led to justice not just for himself, but for the victims who deserved better, and for a community that needed to confront some uncomfortable truths about how quickly they'd been willing to judge one of their own. Michael Thompson served his country with honor in Afghanistan. He served his wrongful sentence with dignity in Pennsylvania. And now he serves the cause of justice with wisdom earned through suffering that no innocent person should ever have to endure. Some battles are fought with weapons in foreign lands. Others are fought with patience and faith in places where freedom has been stripped away. Michael Thompson won both kinds, and in doing so, he proved that innocence, like truth, may be delayed but can never be permanently denied. The gavel that once condemned him ultimately set him free. And the man who walked out of that prison was the same man who'd walked in 15 years earlier, a soldier, a father, and most importantly, an innocent man whose faith in justice had been tested in ways most people could never imagine. That faith, battered but unbroken, ultimately proved stronger than the lies that had imprisoned him. And in the end, that made all the difference.